Hello, my name is Joseph and welcome to my presentation about the history of the Alaskan Highway. The reason why I chose this topic is because I wanted to learn more about the history of the highway. I also wanted to learn how it impacted Canada, the Yukon, and Indigenous people. Today, I will be talking about a brief history of the construction of the Alaska Highway and how it impacted the lives of Indigenous people during and after its construction. Now, the Alaska Highway, also known as the Alkan Highway, has played a crucial role in World War II and had lasting impacts in the Yukon's development, economy, and history. It's connected to the lower 48th and Alaska. It starts in Dawson Creek and British Columbia and goes north for about 2,500 kilometers that ends in Delta Junction, Alaska. It was the largest undertaking at the time for Northern construction project and today still remains as one of the largest projects today. It serves as a transportational route for tourists that are seeking to explore the beautiful scenery of the Yukon wilderness. It is also essential for resource development and emergency evacuations. It has also helped the development of trucking, oil, mining, and forest industries. But how was it built? When was it built? And how is this highway significant in Yukon's and Indigenous people's history? This project had positively shaped Yukon's history, changed their way of life, their economy forever. However, it also has its downsides. As of Indigenous people, mainly Tlingit, Kwanlin and Tankochan Council, had struggled during and after its construction. Disrespect of animals in the land, degradation of the environment, and discrimination are key examples. In this photo essay, when we explore the historical significance of the highway and examining its dark sides, we can better understand the changes that made Yukon the way it is. Before I talk about the construction of the highway and its impacts, I still need to talk about the relationship between the indigenous people and and the lands. I also need to give context about what the Yukon was like during the 19th century. Now, for 11,000 years, the indigenous people have lived in these lands. Their cultures have been spreading out, they have been diversified and flourished. They were hunting, harvesting, living before and after getting in contact with Europeans and Euro-Canadians. They lived a nomadic lifestyle. They followed the food and the seasons, which means they lived off the land. Now, in early 19th century, trading posts were established by Peter Pond and Alexander Mackenzie for easy access of rifles, horses, metal tools, and food materials like sugar, tea, and flour. The lives of indigenous people were changing, but they still retained their traditional knowledge in daily life, and they still had great relationship with the lands until the start of the Klondike Gold Rush in 1897 to 1899, which had a significant impact on their lives. It started when there was word spreading around the discovery of gold by the Tagish people and a white prospector. It unleashed a desire to open the Peace River area to settlement and change the position of the federal government about treaties that are now part of northern eastern BC and western Alberta. The population declined dramatically after the end of the gold rush because it was difficult to get around the region as it was difficult to get in and out. In 1935, the Canadian government began surveying a possibility for airfield sites to attempt the development of an aviation route that would stretch North America to North Asia. Now, a brief history of why the highway was constructed. It was initially proposed seriously in 1929 between the United States and the then territory of Alaska. They wanted to build the highway to service military outposts that would dot the landscapes of Alaska and provide support in the form of airplanes and other military supplies to the USSR. The urgency of the highway's construction began after the invasion of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. The Americans feared that Japan would attack them again in the north and believed that the construction of the road would gain easy access to protecting the land. Construction officially began on March 11, 1942, after President Franklin Roosevelt authorized its construction. The date was only about 3 months after the Pearl Harbor incident, which was very quick. Over 25,000 men and with a mix of Canadian and American civilians and soldiers. They had worked tirelessly over harsh weather conditions and northern terrain in the next 8 months on completion. What was the construction like? The Alaska Highway was considered to be the most expensive project during World War II. The cost was about $185 million, and it took around 7,000 pieces of equipment to build the highway. It included trucks, bulldozers, snowplows, and generators and cranes. There were also other construction projects ongoing as well, and they included the Canal Pipeline and the Alaska Military Highway telephone and telegraph line. Due to the winter arriving, there were many delays on construction. Freezing temperatures that could freeze the skin in seconds, putting the highway builders at risk, preventing progress. In its initial completion, it had to undergo continuous revisions. It was considered unfinished for years until the Public Roads Administration oversaw the construction of a paved roadway employing civilian contractors. Today, the Alaska Highway appears completed following the war. As you look to the left, the, the group photo is the people who actually worked the highway, the construction of the highway. And if you look at the bottom, those are the equipment used in building the highway. During and after the construction of the highway, relationship had dramatically changed and shifted people's kinship and familial ties, which were an essential part of their society. Before the construction, people traveled on foot, boat, snowshoes, sled, and horseback. There were also few roads back then, but they were not made of concrete. Instead, they were made of dirt. Because of the overhunting near the areas of the highway and Haines Road, the government placed about 10,000 kilometers squared in reserve. I will talk about the overhunting in the next slides. The area was traditionally part of the Southern Shoshone hunting lands, which includes Champaign, Ashiheek, and Klein First Nation. They were forcibly removed from subsistence locales and traditional land because the Yukon Commissioner declared a no shooting zone along the highway. The Klein Game Sanctuary was also made to prohibit indigenous people and newcomers from trapping and hunting in the area. The Indian Affairs Branch knew that overhunting occurred because of the U.S. Army hunting big game, and still indigenous people were removed. After the construction, it made it easier for children to be taken away from their families and be put in residential schools. Uh, How were indigenous people affected? Now, as the rise of population and the arrival of construction crews increased, so were infectious diseases. Measles, influenza, whooping cough, and mumps were especially present and infecting the indigenous people. If you look at the left, those were the construction crews that had arrived to build the bridge. The spread of the disease were quick because men were so close in proximity to each other and to the local people living near the highway's path. The children and infants were especially vulnerable to them. It was so bad that the disease killed off 50% of the indigenous people. They did not do the labor of the building, they were only guiding the settlers through the land using their dogs, sled trails, and walking trails to where the road would be placed. There were also several accounts of abuse and introducing addictive substances by soldiers and to the indigenous people. Older people describe about young girls who froze to death or died in violent ways after their involvement with the men or the soldiers or the construction crews. An interview of historian Ken Coast by the PBS special says that there were a lot of attacks on Aboriginal people. Some, you know, of Native women, for example. A lot of misuse of alcohol with Aboriginal people, so a world ended. A lifestyle that had been in place in many ways for centuries, but certainly since the arrival of fur traders in the middle of the 19th century, it's 100 years of fishing, trapping, and sort of casual engagement with the market economy. Poof, gone overnight. Economically, the impacts were also just as devastating for several reasons. Number one, the road development caused steamboats to disappear. Many indigenous people have been working as woodcutters and deckhands for decades, and suddenly they lost their jobs. Trading was also impacted as fur prices had dropped. The reason was because there was low demand of furs in other parts of the world. The decline caused financial hardships for many families. There were family allowances that would provide at least $5 a month, but they also had strict rules. For example, children had to attend to residential schools to be allowed a family allowance. Fathers had to travel very far away, while the mothers and children had to stay at homes, causing issues in familial relations. The government ignored matrilineal social organizations, which indicated hereditary rights. Forced registration of trap lines caused community and family disruptions. Many argued that the interventions represented coercion on the part of the government and paternalism. There were also environmental impacts as well. The goal was to build the highway as fast as possible, and as a result, 12,000 American soldiers came through and plowed the lands as fast as possible. They sent survey crews with indigenous guides, and after that, they sent bulldozers to carve about 50 to 90 feet of the landscape. If you look at the photo in the middle, that's how devastating it was for the construction of the highway. Due to the difficulty of navigating the terrains, many things were also left behind after the construction. And if you look at the right, that's that's a truck during the construction that was left behind by the soldiers. The displacement of trees, fauna, and flora and animals were greatly impacted. During the construction, the United States asked the Yukon government to allow the Army to have hunting license in their residence. Local indigenous people who lived through the area stated that animals were hunted for sport and over-harvested. This means that carcasses were often left to rot. There were some good news as the Yukon government had finally recognized the mistreatment against the indigenous people and the lands during its construction. 11 Yukon First Nation people had signed land claims of self-governments with the agreement of the Yukon government. The agreements are settlements that are negotiated to how indigenous and non-indigenous people and government will work and live with each other in Yukon. A quote by Robin Brashdak, who was a negotiator, said that reconciliation is about restoring friendly relations. It's about restoring balance and righting wrongs. The agreements included partnership between the Yukon government and the First Nation government. The umbrella final agreement, being signed in 1993, was incredibly important as it provides a general agreement made by the three parties in a number of areas. If you look to the left, this is a photo of Judy Gingell, who is a member of the Council of Yukon First Nation, giving a thumbs up at the signing of the Umbrella Final Agreement in 1993. The Council of Yukon First Nation Grand Chief Peter Johnson says that the agreement brings traditional forms of governments and cultures together with Western forms of government. The path of reconciliation is based on the willingness to accept diversity in the culture, and it prevents marginalization of Yukon First Nation. Cultures of First Nations are now being celebrated in the Yukon, and an example is the Adika Cultural Festival. In conclusion, the construction had brought destruction and negative impacts towards indigenous people and their community, spreading diseases, disrespecting the animals and land, and abusing the people, etc. They must be acknowledged that these did indeed happen and ensure that the incidents will never happen again. While it is easy to think that the construction was all negative, it is also important to bring up its positive impacts. For example, the highway is the backbone of most economic activity in northeastern BC and northern Canada, especially in the Yukon. The highway's sustainable access allowed for the integration of the region into the national economy through both non-renewable and renewable resource. It also supported transformed transportation and mining production. The highway would become the main street for both northern British Columbia and Yukon. For instance, Dawson Creek community transformed from a small prairie into a regional center. Recognizing both the benefits and harm is essential in moving forward through understanding and reconciling with the indigenous people. Learning from the past can help improve the future of similar projects with aims to listen to the voices of the indigenous communities. These include the decision making and that they have rights and traditions that need to be preserved and respected. Thank you so much for listening to my PowerPoint presentation. I really hope you enjoy. Here are the references used in my presentation. I used the APA format, and these are also the references for my pictures. Thank you so much.